introducing and organizing this panel. And I wanted to thank all of the GRILA comrades here in Toronto and elsewhere in the world for all the work that they did to make this possible. And to all of you who are here to take time out of your Saturday to celebrate African Liberation Day with us. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. And my remarks as part of this conversation will focus on Pan-African Marxist theory and what it might offer us in this continued struggle for liberation. So as many of you know, in the 20th century, as national independence movements were gaining ground on the African continent, African anti-colonial intellectuals devised new ways of thinking about liberation in the Pan-African context. And this theoretical tradition, which is sometimes called Black Marxism, Pan-African Marxism, or anti-colonial Marxism, was developed to aid national independence movements in their more revolutionary aims through an analysis of the political economy and the culture of Africa in the world system. So through this analysis of the history and political economy of the African continent, Pan-African Marxists rethought European narratives of Africa's integration into the capitalist world system through European imperialism. And this revealed economic development to be a relative concept that hinged on the exploitation of Africa by Europe through colonialism and neo-imperialism. So not only did Pan-African Marxist theorists describe this long history of African political economy as a way to build strategy for national independence movements in their fight against colonialism, but they also took up the question of how true liberation might be realized across the continent. And one of the main tensions that we can see, especially looking back to these early debates among Pan-African Marxists and thinking through the question of liberation at this moment of the end of formal colonial rule, was between those who saw a return to pre-colonial cultural formations as a way towards liberation versus those who contended that the way forward was to embrace the new. So for Marxist thinkers such as Sheikh Anta Diop and Walter Rodney, recovering pre-colonial histories and culture was an important assertion of national identity and as a way to overcome the colonial mentality that lingered after flag independence. Walter Rodney famously wrote that, quote, "To know ourselves, we must learn about African history and culture. This is one of the most important steps towards liberation." For those who subscribe to this position, the process of recovering history and culture was ultimately the way to recover one's humanity. Other Pan-African Marxists, however, such as Aquino de Braganza, Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, and Frantz Fanon, for example, emphasize newness as the means to liberation. Fanon believes that recovering pre-colonial culture was not an effective strategy for liberation. In the face of systematic structures that assert the inferiority of the culture of the colonized, he contended that culture solidifies into a formalism, which is more and more stereotyped. So instead of engaging in critique and evolution, the intellectual who looks to the past for inspiration has this tendency, as Fanon identified, to reify older cultural forms by combating the colonial project to devalue culture on the terms delineated by the colonizer. In such a reification, Fanon asserted, there is no real creativity and no overflowing life. In other words, in looking to the pre-colonial past for inspiration, the post-colonial intellectual renders themselves incapable of creating the new movements that will best critique colonialism and its remnants. Fanon tells us that recovering this pre-colonial past is not enough to counteract the harm done by colonialism. Instead, he urges to look forward and envision a future in which liberation triumphs over colonialism and its remnants. This vision for a new future must also look to other places within the global South for affinity in grappling with similar problems such as trade union questions or economic issues stemming from a common colonial legacy. Now, if we can think about these two positions within this debate, admittedly, they're not really that distinct. Both sides ultimately agree that the goal of recovering the history and pre-colonial culture of Africa is secondary to the revolutionary movement against capitalism and neo-imperialism. What is distinct in these two positions, however, is the means to this end of liberation for Africa. And the key question around which this debate was centered remains. Is the way forward to liberation through recovering the past, Or is it found in creating completely new ways to think about the current situation? So bear with me if you may, and I would like to recall Marx's famous quote from the 18th Brumaire, in which he writes that history happens first as tragedy and then as farce. The tradition of the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living, and just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something that had never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service and borrow from them their names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time honored disguise and this borrowed language. So here, Marx describes how, there's this repetition through the cyclical nature of time. But each time history repeats itself, it's not a return to the exact conditions of a past, but instead there's always some kind of a mimicry of the previous moments of history. In human attempts to create this new, there's always necessarily a borrowing from and simulation of the past. Jacques Derrida returned to this genre of repetition hauntology. And if we can think about it through this framework, Marxism then becomes this ghost whose expected return repeats itself again and again in moments of political, social, and in the case of now, also ecological and public health crises. Now, this recurring return is not solely a reappearance, but also each time a new beginning. So one of the things that I'd like to urge us to do as a group in the question and answer, but also through and other discussion, is to question what Pan-African Marxism still is. And when we think about it through this concept of ontology, it implies two temporalities, that which is no longer but remains, and that which has not yet happened, but the idea of it exists. So Marx describes the cyclical return where each new phase of the cycle is borrowed from the previous, but different because of our desire for newness, coupled with a human inability to conjure it without the old surviving within the new. So when Derrida thinks about this, he talks about this expected return that never quite happens, but nonetheless clears the way for something new because there cannot be a return, only a new beginning in the guise of the old. But if we think of a thinker like Mark Fisher, for example, he sees hauntology as a failed mourning. It's about refusing to give up the ghost or the refusal of the ghost to give up on us. So the question then is, are we failing in our endeavor for a completely new politics, as Marx would claim, or creating new through the ghosts of the old, as Derrida might contend, or mourning the new future as we expected would come, but never quite materialized, as Mark Fisher suggests? So what we can get from this more theoretical or abstract discussion of the way time and theory relate to each other is, what is the way forward? Do we look back to Pan-African Marxism of the moment of national independence to address contemporary challenges that are leading to stalled liberation? Or do we need brand new ideas and new guiding insights in order to truly usher in the liberation that independence promised but has yet failed to deliver? So I'm really looking forward to hearing the panelists and the audience thoughts on this critical question of whether Pan-African Marxism can provide a way forward. But before I wrap up, I just want to offer two examples through which we might be able to think through how Pan-African Marxist thought might still be relevant in helping us develop solutions to the current crisis. So as I'm sure almost all of you on this call are familiar with, Fanon wrote about global health inequities stemming from the colonial legacy in his essay, Medicine and Colonialism. And I was going back to that in preparing my thoughts for this talk to think through the COVID crisis in particular. And I was struck through his historical examples from colonial Algeria, how he saw the relationship between African people and the colonial healthcare system as structured fundamentally and foundationally by the colonial relationship. And he describes the quote unquote inhuman methods of colonialism that mediated Algerian and, in his Pan-African thinking, African people more broadly's experiences with the latest medical technology, whether it's through medical experiments that the French conducted on colonial subjects, or the historical legacy of French doctors aiding the colonial police and military in torturing FLN members, or through the denial of treatment to Africans in need. So based on what Fanon witnessed as a healthcare professional himself in Algeria, he concluded that one of the primary objectives for liberation and decolonization involves disrupting Europe as an intermediary in bringing medical technology to Africa. So we can see today in the case of COVID-19 that Fanon's assessment of the healthcare system in colonial Algeria is markedly similar today, very unfortunately. And access to COVID-19 vaccines, as we know, is mostly mediated through the US and Europe. And the situation in which African countries have to go through former colonial powers to access vaccines is something that Fanon's essay predicted. So to prevent a situation in which there is this need to go through Europe as a mediator to access latest technologies, this was something he identified in the late 1950s as a key problem that African liberation movements needed to take up in order to ensure access to just and plentiful healthcare. And while he may not have predicted the specificities of vaccine hoarding, along with the patent laws that restrict the ability of global South countries to produce their own affordable vaccines, he did warn us in the 1950s of the pressing need to be able to access the latest medical technology without having to rely on Europe as a mediator. But the failure of national liberation to be realized today is not for lack of trying, I would argue. In the contemporary period, we've witnessed many movements for liberation, whether it's across North Africa, in the Sudan, and elsewhere, along with vibrant student movements across the continent, with a variety of other types of movements aimed at realizing liberation in various forms. But these contemporary movements, particularly the political movements aimed at regime change, have been limited by authoritarian rule, and particularly by religious nationalist forces that's hijacked the more revolutionary aims of contemporary movements. And here too, I believe that Pan-African Marxism, and Fanon in particular, can provide us a way forward. So in the famous essay on violence, there was this really crucial question for independence movements, and that is, to paraphrase, what was the point of fighting for independence if not much had changed in the period following? So as all of you I'm sure know, Fanon was talking about the class structures that remained in place after flag independence, and posed this question as a critique that while formal political rule by Europe may have ended, independence movements still to combat capitalism and imperialism. So I think that we need to push this question a little bit further, and in order to update it for the way that these kinds of political formations keep repeating, and to consider how the revolutionary promise of national independence soon eroded into the proliferation of dictatorships across the continent. And we see local born leaders who oppressed then the very people who had won their independence in a similar manner as the colonial rulers they fought for freedom from. And we're seeing today, I think, a resurgence in movements that are looking to now realize that quality of freedom that independence movements promised, but in so many instances failed to deliver, and even had some moments and decades of backsliding. Yet, I think in the current moment, this political freedom still remains an open question as we see far-right forces seeking to limit the political freedom. And in the face of that, we also see movements that are fighting and waging on this promise of freedom. So I just want to wrap up by saying that I believe that there are infinite possibilities for the future. That's just sort of a philosophical fact. So the goal of political action is to begin with this workable possible and then transform that possible into the future real. And in this endeavor to imagine possible futures, I believe that theory is crucial, and I would, push for a Pan-African Marxist theory. And we know that futures are not ready, waiting for us like heavenly bodies, but they must be invented, fabricated, and created. And through a return to Pan-African Marxist theory, I'd like to argue, we can begin to imagine new possibilities outside of historical capitalism and imperialism. And this may seem insurmountable, but I do think that we're limited by our inability to imagine. Conceiving of new possibilities, I think, is a really crucial first step in imagining and then enacting a possible future in which liberation triumphs. So thank you to everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing.
Okay,